Okay, up next, we have Bernal from the National Director, Stop Predatory Gambling. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, committee, and I'm here to highlight 4 trends about state government-sanctioned gambling today. And a couple of things about our organization. Stop Predatory Gambling is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we're a national government reform network of individuals and organizations from across the United States. And we believe in improving the lives of the American people with compassion and fairness, and freeing us from the lower standard of living, exploitation, and fraud that commercialized gambling spreads. So we're one of the most diverse organizations in the United States, one in which progressives work side by side with conservatives with a common national purpose. And it's noteworthy that I'm here today working with one of our partners here in Connecticut, the Coalition Against Gambling Expansion. It's one of our active members of our network. And I particularly want to recognize the 2 people that lead that. Robert Steele, many of you know, former congressman here, is one of my personal heroes on this issue, someone who I think has spent his retirement educating thousands of Americans about why this is a failed approach. And I also want to recognize Michelle Mudrick, who's here, who helps lead the coalition here in the state. We're here because particularly we filed an amicus brief in the U.S. Supreme Court case that's dealing with sports gambling. And that brief was co-signed by some of the most influential liberal and conservative organizations in the United States. And it was written by one of the top consumer justice appellate lawyers in the country. And so I just want to take 10 seconds and explain to you why I'm even here as I got into the gambling issue. I grew up in Massachusetts. I played sports my whole life. I was a high school and college basketball coach. My ambition was to become a city manager for a community near where I lived. And it wasn't until really about 15 years ago I was working as a chief of staff in the Massachusetts Senate, and I read a New York Times Magazine cover story on slot machines. And the New York Times reporter had gone out as part of that story to interview IGT, which many of you know is the leading manufacturer of slot machines in the country. And the New York Times reporter is going up to each employee, and he's asking them, do you play the slot machines that you make? And to a person, none of them gambled. And then he went up to one final slot machine designer. And he asked the slot designer, do you play these machines? And the gentleman spit on the floor. And he said, slots are for losers. Okay? So if you have ever read that New York Times story, that changed the arc of my life because I had a whole different career path. Because when we talk about slots are for losers, this isn't Bank of America doing this. These losers, when I was working in Massachusetts, these were our constituents. And here in Connecticut, these are your constituents. Okay? These losers. And you can't think of another company that would refer to their customers with such disdain and arrogance. So some may be sitting here, let people gamble if they want, if you say, But our response to that is we already have the freedom to gamble. Up to now, many Americans participate in office pools for the Super Bowl, NCAA March Madness brackets in a week or two. You can make the chairman and I go golfing, we don't make a casual wager on the golf course. That's not what we're talking about. That's social gambling. There's no house skimming a large profit, no aggressive and deceptive marketing to get people to gamble more often with bigger sums of money. No one is lending or borrowing cash to participate all day, every day of the week, year-round. And it doesn't require the majority of Americans who rarely gamble to subsidize it with any of their own money. And that's in contrast to predatory gambling, okay, which is why we're here today. And predatory gambling, just to give you the decisive definition, it's when state governments partner with powerful corporate gambling interests to operate and market for-profit gambling to citizens in their communities. So the first of the 4 trends I'm going to focus on today is this. The first trend is you have an ever-increasing number of your constituents are suffering life-changing financial losses because of state-sanctioned gambling, a serious problem that will be made far worse if you allow sports betting. The Economist just recently posted a story that the American people have lost $117 billion on state-sanctioned gambling in 2016. $117 billion of the American people money, of their money was lost on state-sanctioned gambling. So what I took it and tried to do that for Connecticut, because with all the studies, Connecticut's had, gambling here for 25 years with your casinos. I looked through all your stuff. I've never seen anyone look at how much money do actually the citizens of Connecticut lose. So I took most of my day on Tuesday, and I created a whole chart, and I'm happy to share this with the committee when we're done. And I went through out of all the losses of Connecticut residents, okay? And so when you add it all up, and keep in mind, these revenue numbers, there's only slot revenues from your casinos. We don't have the revenues from table games. And you also can estimate that roughly 50% of the gamblers at your Connecticut casinos are from Connecticut. So the total amount of money lost by Connecticut citizens in the last 25 years, excluding losses on table games, and that's if you add up Foxwoods, Mohegan Sun, the Connecticut Lottery, and your off-track betting, okay, is more than $25 billion of money that was lost by Connecticut residents, many of whom are your constituents. Okay? Imagine that $25 billion impact if it was spent in other ways in terms of building a middle class and growing a middle class here, helping people get out of poverty. And so let's just put this in contrast. According to their own numbers, because we're talking about what trend, Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun, they employ about 14,000 people combined today. All right? Yet most of your statewide gambling councils, they talk about here that roughly 2 to 5% of Connecticut citizens are now gambling addicts. That's a standard number, somewhere between 2 to 5%. Okay? That's a range of between 71,000 to 178,000 people. Okay? You employ 15,000 people part-time and full-time jobs at your state's casinos. Okay? You have 5 times, at a minimum, more addicts in your state than people who work at the state's casinos. So when we talk about economic development, think of another economic development policy that will generate that kind of financial ruin and public health harm. It's remarkable when you put it in those numbers. And so when you're going to do a study on this issue, don't use a gambling industry consultant firm to do it. Generally do an independent study. So, and the question I love to ask every respective legislators when we're talking about this issue is, we hear a lot about responsible gambling. We're going to do responsible gambling. Responsible gambling is a slogan. And the way you get an answer to that question, to how you can really determine why it's a slogan, is ask gambling operators when they come before you, ask them what percentage of their gambling profits, come from people who practice so-called responsible gambling behavior. Okay, has anyone ever come before you and answered that question? What percent? We hear about responsible gambling. How much money do they make from the citizens, these so-called casual gamblers? All right, Natasha Shull, MIT professor, wrote Addiction by Design. If it's a book that you haven't read, it's a must-read. Okay, in that she has a book. Quotes a study where roughly 75% of the people coming into a casino to gamble were casual gamblers. Yet the study showed that 4% of gambling profits came from those 75% of casual players. Okay, so it's the out-of-control player that's the bedrock of gambling industry revenues, which in turn are the bedrock of state revenues. It's the out-of-control player. So anyone's responsible gambling is little more than it gives you appearance that there's concern, but generally it's a meaningless slogan. And if you bring in sports gambling, it's going to make this problem even worse. A neighboring state of Massachusetts did a must-read study that you have to read from 2015. It did a survey of 10,000 adults, and it wasn't paid by gambling interest. It was done by UMass Amherst. It said sports bettors had higher rates of problem gambling at 5.7% when compared with adults who bet at casinos, bought lottery tickets, raffle tickets, and so on. And to compound that, gamblers who bet online had even higher problem gambling rates at 18.2%. So you bring in sports gambling, most of whom ultimately wanted this online, like you're addicting even more people of your citizens already that are being harmed here. And so what about, there's a big push about the people being in debt in our country, all the people trying to, give people opportunity. These online gamblers that if you go down this road of sports gambling, they get caught up in significant financial debt. All right, one of the few countries in the world that has legalized sports gambling, the country of Ireland, just released their first national survey ever on gambling. Okay, and they found that 75% of online gamblers in Ireland have borrowed money or sold something in order to place a bet. Okay, so this isn't about casual people. The people are going into debt. 75% of the people doing online gambling in Ireland, some of the companies here, these other companies, Paddy Power, companies going to come into the U.S., they're doing business in these countries. Okay? 75% of those players went into debt to do this stuff. And why are people going into debt? Well, an ESPN journalist who covers gambling for the ESPN magazine told an Ohio newspaper in 2016 that in Australia, they did a survey of one of the accounts at a major bookmaker. Out of over 500,000 accounts, about 50 individuals were found to be profitable. Okay, think about that. Over 500,000 accounts, okay, of these sports gamblers were found to be profitable. Okay, 50 of them. Okay, who are we doing this for? This isn't to benefit anybody. This is to benefit some very powerful financial interests. Okay, I mean that should anyone, if you're the biggest gambling proponent ever, what a huge ripoff that is for the American people, for your constituents. You know, and so William Hill Sportsbook was here today. If you're going to do that, ask them this question: how many individuals make in your accounts over an extended period profit in their sportsbook? How many of those accounts are profitable over an extended period of time? Let's get an answer to that question. Okay, and so this to kind of summarize, to move off this first trend. How many other votes do you ever take in your career that literally cause financial ruin in the lives of even one of your constituents back in your districts? Because when you support this policy, when you continue to expand on it, that's what you're doing. And I know that's not your intent, but that's the reality. Second trend is gambling operators are aggressively trying to get an entire new generation of young people hooked on gambling. Okay? We talk about, the gentleman from William Hill talked about the kind of marketing that you see in stadiums, uniform patches, the advertising within the arena. Like, who do you think watches that? I grew up playing sports my whole life. I was a kid, I love sports. I watched every Red Sox game, Patriots game, Celtics game. I mean, in countries that have legalized sports gambling, like Australia, consistently, studies show that children in those countries are repeatedly exposed to harmful messages and advertisements about sports gambling. The frequency of sports gambling ads, it normalizes gambling for kids. These kids come to see gambling as central to playing and watching sports. So rather than talking about, whether the Red Sox won, they start talking about what are the odds of the Red Sox going to win tonight. It changes the way we interact with sports, especially for kids. And we touched on it here, but I don't think many of the members here really fully sense. When we talk about sports gambling in 2018, we talk about the straight bet. This in-play betting, they say their profit margin is low on in-play betting. That's where the money is, because instead of placing one bet in one game, I'm placing a bet every 10 seconds. Is Tom Brady going to throw a pass on this next play? Yes or no? I mean, these bets, constant wagering. So while their margin may be smaller, that's where the money is. They want in-play betting. So the idea that you don't think that changes the way we interact with sports? And aside from, when we talk about sports gambling includes wagering on any contest. So it's not just traditional sports. We're talking about wagering on stuff called esports, which, if you're not up to speed in esports, you have competitive video game teams today across the country, which is an incredible phenomenon. So you have young people, you think how many, if you have kids or grandkids, nieces and nephews, think how much they play video games today. We're talking about bringing gambling onto those games. Okay, it's been a huge controversy. The Federal Trade Commission hearing just last week brought up this whole concept of video game gambling. It's a huge issue that you have to look at if you bring this up. But that's what we're talking about. When we say sports gambling, it's anything that means a contest, and that's how they try to define the language. Things like The Bachelor show. Maybe you have daughters, your wife maybe watches The Bachelor show, The Bachelorette show, the Oscars. There's wagering on these events. Huge wagerings. Again, widening the amount of people that are gambling in your state and in your country. And much of it's all happening in online gambling. The key thing that really was not emphasized here enough was the amount of the kind of marketing that goes into this. The United Kingdom, one of the major newspapers there just released a study that 1 out of 5 gambling advertisements, 1 out of 5 ads when you're watching a sporting event is a gambling ad. So 1 out of 5 ads is a gambling ad when you're watching a sporting event in the UK. I mean, you don't think that impacts kids? I mean, it changes the way we watch sports. There was just public outcry when DraftKings and FanDuel did this whole ad buy. I mean, that's outrageous. The uniform patches, stadium walls. And the last thing before I move off this piece is we talked about, you had the gentleman from the Major League Baseball, his exact quote was, illegal operators aren't going away, right? They're standing up in public saying, we're doing this to wipe out these illegal. The illegal, you can't compete with them. William Hill said it. They're competing against illegal folks. If Connecticut gets into this business, you're not just competing against Massachusetts or New York. You're competing against all these illegal operators. And so if you can't shut down the illegal operators now, what makes you think you can shut them down if you legalize this stuff? You know, Australia has legalized sports gambling. It's a huge illegal gambling is still, rampant in Australia. Okay, it's still rampant. So if you're going to do a study on this, get real, honest, independent answers to those questions. The third trend, and it's the most revealing, is this: the third trend is the number of hypocrites involved with government-sanctioned gambling is continuing to grow. Because if there's one revealing truth, it's this: most gambling operators and many of the politicians they partner with, they have this in common. With the zeal of a teetotaler, they don't gamble, okay? You have the IGT employees, slots are for losers, we don't gamble. Steve Wynn on 60 Minutes, the only way you win in a casino, was his quote, is to own it. Jim Murrin, who's been a player here, CEO of MGM, they've been active here in Connecticut. He admitted to the New York Times, he doesn't play slots or table games. The NBA commissioner, Adam Silver, one of America's biggest boosters for government-sanctioned sports gambling, confessed during a speech in Las Vegas in July 2014. I personally enjoy being here in Vegas, but I don't gamble as the commissioner of the NBA, for the record. And even the founders of DraftKings, the online gambling sports book, they confessed to the Boston Globe recently that the founders had never even stepped foot in a casino. They're pushing online gambling. They haven't even stepped foot in a casino. The three of us, quote, have computer science degrees. We're a bunch of dorks that wanted to build something cool. Well, good for them, but thousands of your constituents are going to be financially harmed by this. And if you want to see the whole list of the hypocrites who promote gambling and don't, especially in the gambling industry, and who don't gamble, it's on the homepage of our website. And why don't they gamble? Because it's financially reckless and dangerous. Commercialized gambling. They know they're going to lose their money, and they know it can be highly addictive. It's a big con. And the fourth and final trend for the future is that states who are led by men and women who are strong, visionary leaders will be phasing out state-sanctioned gambling in the years ahead because it's failed. It's inevitable. And it's not a question of if, but when. State-sanctioned gambling is an outdated policy. It's a relic of past failures of leadership. New Jersey is example A of this. States that continue to promote gambling will continue to languish. And many legislators concede gambling has failed. Many of them say, I'm not a fan of this, Les, but we have to do this. We kind of need the money. That's why I'm doing this. But government-sanctioned gambling is almost always touted as a way to raise tax revenue. But history has shown repeatedly that this argument is either overstated or wrong. A 2016 national report by the Rockefeller Institute at SUNY Albany, which if you're going to have a hearing, that should be your next hearing, is bringing in Lucy Dedayan, who's the chief researcher in the United States around revenues from gambling. That organization found that while states creating new revenue streams from gambling that might see momentary bumps in income, over the long term, the tax revenue returns deteriorate, and they often do quickly. So this is why government-sanctioned gambling forces even the 2/3 of citizens of your constituents who never gamble. Those people in the state who never gamble, they end up footing the bill for the enormous social costs and state budget problems it leaves behind. So we call this you pay even if you don't play. So all of the citizens who don't gamble, they also suffer a lower standard of living because of the state-sanctioned gambling program. Because the economic impact of commercialized gambling, if you talk to independent economists, it's like throwing your money into the street and paying someone to pick it up. That's all it is. $25 billion your citizens, it's just literally throwing the money into the street and paying someone to pick up that money. There's no the actual impact from gambling itself. It's a sterile redistribution of wealth. And that's why you're seeing major change here in the Northeast, just in surrounding states. In 2016, 62% of New Jersey citizens said that gambling hasn't been good for the state, right from a Quinnipiac poll in November of that year. Have we ever seen a statewide poll here in Connecticut asking your constituents if government-sanctioned casinos and the gambling program here has it been good for the state? Has it been good? One that's not funded by gambling interests. So have you ever seen that poll? I respectfully ask you, as part of your research for this, if you're going to spend it, ask the people of Connecticut if this has been a successful policy. Okay, in 2016, you had New Hampshire voters voted down a referendum to expand casinos by 78% to 22%. New Hampshire rejected casinos again in 2017. The Maine voters in 2017 rejected gambling expansion by 83% to 17%. There's a grassroots movement in Massachusetts that got a question on the ballot to repeal casinos there. So this is kind of a real movement. And this isn't completely driven by individuals from across the political spectrum to make this happen. And right here, you have the growing Connecticut Coalition Against Casino Expansion, okay, which is a network of organizations from across the spectrum that represent more than 1 million people. This is real. So to close, it's evident to me that there's a large number of talented people on this committee. I thought the questions that you asked today were as good as any. I've been to more than 200 hearings nationally the last 10 years. Great questions. But if you start digging on those questions, you follow up on those, you're not going to like what you learn. If you're somebody who kind of leans towards this, if you start kicking the tires on this, it's not what it seems to be. So there's a lot of talented people here, and you have the power to move this state away from its outdated and failed reliance on gambling and chart a better future to improve people's lives with compassion and fairness. And the last thing I just say on that study, keep talking about this, there's a lot of, there's other companies out there like Spectrum that do this. If this state was going to place a big bet on coal, right? If you're going to say, we're going to bring in the coal industry, would you go out and hire a consultant that works for the coal industry? Would you do that? Of course you wouldn't. You go out and get the best independent research you find, and consistently, and Connecticut's not alone in this. They hire companies like Spectrum Gaming, I should say, the Innovation Group, and they hire consultants. These are gambling consultants, okay? Go out and hire you have some of the best scholars in the world in this state, hire real economists to do it, and I think you'll be pleased you did it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Senator Guglielmo.
Yes, thank you for coming. Thanks for your passion. Hey, just a question. One of the concerns I had is that when you legalize something, you bring it out of the shadows, and there'll be certain number of people who, maybe the majority, who wouldn't be involved if it was illegal. But, and you alluded to this in your remarks, do you have any statistics on what you think will happen if the state legalizes it? How many more people will gamble than gamble currently?
Sure. So because this is a new issue in the United States, there isn't American-based research, but we'd have to go Australia and the UK. Yeah. These are places where we'd have to go. Australia is really your best model because they've done in the last 15 years. UK's had gambling a little bit longer, but I think Australia would be a good model to look at for what the rate of gambling growth has been since the introduction of sports gambling. So I can get that information for you. I don't have it at my fingertips, but that people have been studying that. Australia has some of the best research on gambling in the world.
If you could get it to me, because it just makes sense to me that that's going to happen.
Oh, it's no question, because no one's advertising. No one's advertising. 1 out of every 5 ads on an NFL game right now isn't to go gamble. It's not.
No, but it will be.
It will be, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Representative Szydzinski.
Thank you for being here. Clearly, you're very passionate about this, and I appreciate that very much. You mentioned the term deceptive marketing. If you can kind of expand on that and what that means to you and how it affects people that have issues with the gambling.
Sure, and when I say deceptive marketing, it's casinos, it's lotteries, it's any form of state-sanctioned gambling. Many of you may know this, but state-sanctioned gambling is exempt from truth in advertising laws. Okay, they're exempt. The Federal Trade Commission exempts lotteries, especially it's lotteries, which is the biggest part of state-sanctioned gambling. But they're exempt from truth in advertising laws. So if I ran, if I was an insurance company and I went out and I said, come get insurance from me and you can change your life, the Connecticut State Attorney General would be suing me. That's false advertising. Yet the lottery, here it's Connecticut, Massachusetts, whatever, they go selling tickets. $100,000 a year for life, whatever. And people are like, people think they can change their life. You have 50% of your constituents in most of your districts don't own any assets whatsoever. So instead of helping people build assets, we're encouraging people with this incredibly deceptive advertising to put their rent, their food money, whatever, to try to, change their financial future. So it consistently, the amount of deceptive advertising that is with the gambling industry. If you look at it in isolation and compare it to, say, even during the Christmas season, okay, Connecticut lottery, just like every other lottery in the country, they run ads with like Frosty the Snowman on scratch tickets. I mean, think about that. I mean, Frosty, you have images like Frosty the Snowman on a scratch ticket. Okay, if that was, people freaked out when Joe Camel was a cartoon man-made by the tobacco industry to target kids. Like you have Frosty the Snowman, which is an iconic figure for kids everywhere, on scratch tickets. Okay, so we become, and I'm like, I grew up I never questioned this issue of state-sanctioned gambling. It's like the paint on the wall. But when you start looking at this is the public voice of government in Connecticut to most citizens. And what else do you advertise to your people? Maybe go to UConn, but every day the state government of Connecticut is encouraging people to go gamble, something that's not in their best financial interest. And so, in the way they get people to gamble, because the games are rigged, so they have to use all these forms of deceptive advertising.
Thank you very much. And again, appreciate your passion. Thanks for coming here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Damassa, followed by Representative Rivero.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess we can kind of drill down to the basic premise that in your mind, certainly in the testimony you've given us, it's detrimental to our constituents. The idea of some sort of windfall is obviously slim to none, right? So the majority of people who gamble are going to lose. So it would be best for us to keep it illegal to operate any additional gambling in Connecticut. That's the gist of your testimony, if I'm correct. So, I mean, look, and I don't know, listen, I think one of the reasons we're having this hearing, and I thank the chairs for it, I don't know what all the answers are, and I don't know necessarily where you draw the line. I mean, it comes down to, the liberties and freedoms of people to gamble if they so choose. Where do we draw a line? Listen, we put an age on cigarettes, and we put warnings on cigarette packages, but we haven't banned cigarettes, right? So you can pretty much go out and chain smoke yourself to death. We know it probably will kill you right over it, but we still allow it. Why? Because we say, well, listen, if you make that choice and you know the risks and you're going to do it anyway, it's not the state's position to stop you, right? So, I mean, we kind of go on the same line here. In respect to the comment as far as, the representative saying, losers play slot machines. Listen, you know what, should that have been said? Absolutely not. Should someone go into it thinking they're going to win? No. All right, they need to certainly be aware of what the odds are and the fact that when you go to a casino or you go to the lottery, plan on losing what you put out, right? That's the bottom line. But listen, is this strictly to the gambling industry? No, it's not. Okay, we have gambling that goes on in the stock market every day. We have individuals who are not necessarily adverse to those risks, right? And they go and place money with different individuals that are licensed. And listen, they lose a lot of money. Some people lose all their money in stock market schemes. We regulate it, right? We try to regulate it. We try to hold people accountable. But at the end of the day, there are many different forms of gambling out there. And I think it's our responsibility, and certainly I'll give you a chance to comment, I think it's our responsibility to try to make the playing field as fair and as balanced and as protective of the public as we can. But at that point, I think in many instances, it's not our job to restrict people in their activities. So obviously, yeah, I'm sure you have some comments.
And I think it's a very thoughtful question. And I would say 25 years ago, I would have that same exact mindset. What's the big deal? This is happening. Okay, so I'm going to I wrote down kind of, and if I missed one, you let me know. I kind of see 2 or 3 questions in there. One is, why don't we just let people do this? And truthfully, why can't, if this is really about freedom, personal freedom, then why can't I go run my own casino? Why can't I go run my own state lottery? I can't. This is about free market principles. This is the ultimate example of crony capitalism in its purest form. Okay? And so let people gamble. If I want to go gamble, if the chairman and I want to go out and play, hit a golf course, or we play some hoops together and we play, knock yourself out. We have a Friday night poker game together. After, Friday night, come down here, we play. Knock yourself out. That's not what, this is about a house. You have a house involved, skimming money on every gambling bet. Let people gamble all they want. That's really what the intent here. Then let people go gamble. We're already free to gamble. What it is, we're talking about the gambling operators. That's what's illegal. It's not illegal for you to gamble. It's illegal for you to run a gambling business because it's inherently, the reason why it's been prohibited criminalized for most of American history is because it's inherently dishonest and exploitive. The prohibition of alcohol failed, but for most of American history, the criminalization of gambling was successfully practiced until really the last 30 years or 40 years when states started getting into this business. Okay, so that's on the freedom piece. We talk about people know what the odds are and stuff. I just going home today. I'm going to see the billboards for Foxwoods. I'm going to see the radio ads. Like, none of those casinos say, "Hey, listen, you come here, you're going to lose." It's like, "Hey, the lottery ads. You never know. It's ads like, come. We have the winningest slots in the area." Like, they don't market it that way. Let's be honest. No one else does that, respectfully. And the third thing is, I get this a lot. Gambling's like the stock market, right? I mean, it's like the stock market. And this is one of my favorite examples because I think on average, I would think 30 years ago, what's the difference? I'm buying a stock versus, going to the slot machine. The huge difference is a couple major differences. One is, from a big picture standpoint, there's a difference between investing and speculation. Okay, if I buy a piece of a major insurance company here in Hartford and their stock, like, I'm buying a piece of a company. Okay, banks, it's so credible. Banks will sometimes loan me money on those stocks. Okay, try walking into your local bank with $10,000 worth of scratch tickets and saying, "Hey, can I use this as collateral?" Of course, they'd laugh you out of the place. So there's a difference between speculation. Some of the derivatives we talk about, those in the financial markets, no question that's gambling. But buying stocks, there's a risk element to it, but that's not, it's not gambling in the sense that you're going to lose. And take Standard & Poor's over the last 40 years. If I had put, $1,000 a year away on Standard & Poor's, for the last 25 years, 30 years, I'd be, pretty wealthy. If I had wagered $1,000 a year on gambling, state sanctioned, I'd lose it all. So that's a difference.
And Justin, this is just my final point, and there's no question, just off of what you said, one thing not to toot some of the very smart policy makers in this building, and I'm not including myself in that, but I think the thing you pointed out about casinos, I think we are looking at that, and we're trying to look at a competitive process, because I think you're right. I don't think it's fair that we pick winners and losers in that. And the only other thing I would say is, as far as the stock market piece, what I really equated to was more or less, we have had firms in the past, we saw it in 2008, that look, you know what? They literally sold products, sold securities to people that they knew at the time of sale had no value at all. So they did. They knew somebody was going to lose money. Goldman Sachs was a great example. They have publicly on record, in Congress, come out and said, absolutely, we sold securities to our client at the same time we were betting against those securities because we knew there were issues with their value. So, again.
But you're not trying to expand. I mean, right. You're not expanding that practice. You're outraged by that practice, and rightfully so. You're trying to shut that practice down. State attorney generals in the country went after these big banks for those predatory practices. Here, including Connecticut, most times you don't have the state attorney general going after these predatory practices. Everyone looks the other way. So I agree with you. We should be outraged at those predatory practices and shutting them down and protect ordinary Americans.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you.
Okay, Representative Rivero, I'm sorry. Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I'm not quite as passionate as you are about gambling, but if you look at my record on this committee, I voted against most expansion of gambling. But I must say this, that when I go back to my district and people look how I vote, and I'll catch hell sometimes and I get complimented sometimes, but I have never had one person yet, and I mean this sincerely, and I'm against gambling because I know what it does to families. But I have never had one person yet come up to me and say, "Here's Danny, I think that was a good vote you made." Honestly, I hate to say that, but the people in my district, when I go back there, they don't turn around and say, "Thank you for that vote." And I think that's one of the problems. I'll agree with everything you said, but as a legislator, it's pretty hard to go against the people that you represent. And unfortunately, most of the people that we represent aren't really against gambling like you are, and probably like I am also. Not quite as passionate as you, but and these are the people we represent. So I don't think anybody should get upset with a legislator that votes for more gambling because they can see the dollar signs for the state, and we need all the dollars we can get because people aren't against it.
Well,
So I thank you for your testimony.
Sure. What do you think? So,
Thank you.
as I say, it's a relic of a failed leadership in the past. Like, state-sanctioned gambling is a relic of failure. That's what it is. So visionary leaders trying to improve opportunity for everyday Americans. The movement is away from state-sanctioned gambling. And to your point about, constituents, 2/3 of your constituents don't gamble at all, so they don't really follow this issue. They don't know how this issue impacts them. And I'd say the reason what's changed the American psyche on this issue is not because there's no, unlike other issues that come before you, even marijuana, there's no grassroots movement for casinos in Connecticut. There's no grassroots movement for sports betting. This is being driven by very powerful financial interests, okay? So there's no movement for this. So you may not necessarily get a slap on the back, hey, great job, representative, for voting, but there's no one pounding the table for this in your district. What people want is opportunity, and this has been framed by gambling industry lobbyists and PR firms as this is our economic solution. This is how we can rebuild our state. This is how we can pay for schools. So average people are like, oh, well, that sounds great. That's why they've been being misled. If you ask people, do you want casinos in your town? Do you want them? Most people say no. Most people say no. There's no grassroots movement for this.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. We're good? All right, this concludes our hearing. I want to, again, thank everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to come here and testify. Thank you very much.
Thank you.